Sold to a debtor by her stepfather, the Omega was claimed when the Alpha King paid double. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. And now, let's go back to our main character. Emily Carter had learned the sound of money before she learned the sound of safety. The scratch of pen on paper, the hush of voices bargaining over numbers, the clink of coins that never reached her hands. And this morning the town hall smelled like old wood and cold air, as if the walls themselves had heard too many deals like this one. Her name written in ink she had not chosen, her future measured in dollars she would never see. And as she stood near the long table, she kept her shoulders square because breaking would only make it easier for them to look past her. For Richard Hale to avoid her eyes as he shifted his weight and cleared his throat. For Marcus Vane to tap a finger as if time were the only thing he owned. Emily felt the word debtor settle into the room like dust, light enough to breathe, yet heavy enough to choke. And she remembered the nights she counted the steps from the porch to the fence. 8 steps. The distance it took to feel brave, the distance it took to feel alone. The distance that now felt like a mile because no one asked her to sit, no one asked her to speak. The papers slid forward and the numbers were said out loud. Sums that sounded precise and final, a total that fit neatly into a ledger. And when Richard nodded, it was not an agreement so much as a surrender, a quiet one, practiced, and Emily understood in that moment how a person could be present and still be erased. How a life could be summarized by a balanced do. How her last name could be lifted from her like a coat and handed across the table. Marcus smiled without warmth. He did not touch her. He did not need to. Ownership did not require hands. It required witnesses. And there were plenty. The clerk's pen scratched, a chair creaked, the clock ticked, and Emily counted again. 8 steps. The fence, the field beyond. The place where the wind used to feel kind. She did not cry because tears would have been a concession. And she had learned that dignity could be quiet, that standing still could be a choice. The word sold was never spoken, but it moved between them all. The same. And when the papers were signed, she felt lighter in a way that scared her, as if gravity itself had loosened its grip, as if the floor could tilt at any second. The hall doors opened somewhere behind them. A change in the air, a pause that did not belong to anyone at the table. And Emily did not turn yet. She waited, because she had learned that some moments announce themselves only if you let them. And in the space of a single breath, she felt something shift, not hope, not fear, but the sense that the room had found a new center, that whatever came next would not ask her to be small. Emily did not look back at Richard Hale as the clerk gathered the papers because looking back would have turned memory into permission, and she refused to grant that. Instead, she focused on the grain of the table, the faint groove where countless hands had rested before hers. People who had believed a signature could end a story. The air felt thinner now, as if the room had exhaled and forgotten to breathe back in. Marcus Vane shifted closer with the confidence of someone accustomed to outcomes, not people, his voice smooth when he spoke her name as though familiarity could soften ownership. Emily lifted her chin. She did not answer. Silence was the last thing that still belonged to her. The clock ticked again, loud enough to feel like a heartbeat, and she counted the seconds as a way to stay present. The doors behind them closed without a sound, and the hush that followed was different, deliberate, the kind that spreads when attention is claimed rather than requested. Footsteps crossed. The floor measured and unhurried, boots polished to a quiet shine, fabric moving with weight and purpose. And when Emily finally turned, it was not because she was told to, but because the room itself seemed to tilt toward a single point. A man stood a few yards away, flanked by 2 guards who did not look around because they did not need to. His presence carried authority without spectacle, tall without imposing himself, still without stiffness. Emily felt it then, not fear, not awe, but order, like a shelf clicking into place. Conversation stopped. The clerk froze mid-motion. Marcus straightened. Richard swallowed. The man's eyes moved once across the table and paused on Emily as if she were not an item listed but a person observed. The pause mattered. It stretched just long enough to be noticed. Then his gaze returned to the papers. He asked a question quietly. How much? No accusation, no heat, just inquiry. Marcus answered quickly, eager. The number sounded smaller when said aloud. Thinner. The man nodded as if confirming a detail and asked again, including fees, interest, penalties. The clerk stammered. Through the additions. Emily listened to the math like weather passing through. When the total was finished, the man reached into his coat and placed a folder on the table, leather worn smooth at the edges. He opened it and removed a check. The amount written was clean and deliberate. Exactly double. It landed between the papers and the pen without ceremony. The sound it made was soft yet final. Marcus blinked. Richard took a half step back. The clerk hesitated until the man spoke again. Paid in full. The words settled into the room like a verdict. Emily felt the shift before she understood it. The lightness returned, but this time it steadied her. The man turned to her then, and his voice changed. Not softer, but closer. He asked if she understood what had just happened. Emily searched his face for the trick she had learned to expect, and did not find it. She answered yes because she did. He nodded and said from this moment forward she was under his protection, not owned, not transferred. Protected. The distinction mattered. It landed differently, like a bridge instead of a wall. The guard stepped back to give space rather than take it. The clerk began to gather the documents with shaking hands. Marcus found his voice, but not his footing. Richard stared at the floor. Emily felt a coat settle around her shoulders, heavy and warm, not to hide her but to mark her. She inhaled, and the air felt whole again. When the man offered his name, it was simple and unadorned, Alexander Blackwood. And as the room finally breathed, Emily realized that being seen had changed the shape of the day, that whatever she had been sold as no longer applied, and that the path ahead, unknown as it was, had just been reclaimed. The coat settled more fully as Emily followed Alexander Blackwood out of the hall, the air outside cooler and cleaner, the street stretching ahead like a line she had never been allowed to cross until now. People paused as they recognized him, not with fear, but with an instinctive respect that parted the way without a word. Emily walked half a step behind because she did not know the rules yet, and because he did not rush her to learn them. The guards remained at a distance that felt intentional. Present but not pressing, Alexander spoke to her as they moved, explaining where they were going in plain language. A temporary residence a few blocks away, a place to rest and decide next steps. Decide was the word that caught her attention. It rang strange and bright. She nodded and felt the weight of choice like a muscle and used but waking. The building they entered was old brick with wide windows. Inside it smelled of polished wood and citrus. A woman at the desk stood immediately, greeted Alexander by name, and offered tea without being asked. Emily noticed how nothing here required proof of worth, only presence. They sat at a small table near the window and Alexander asked if she was warm enough. The question was ordinary, and that was what made it startling. She answered honestly, and he adjusted the coat at her shoulders with a careful distance. Then he asked what she wanted to do first, not what she needed, not what she should, what she wanted. Emily looked at her hands and realized they were steady. She said she wanted to understand what protection meant. Alexander listened without interrupting, and then explained in clear terms. Protection meant no one could claim her without consent. No contract could be enforced against her will. Her debts were not transferable, because they were never hers to begin with. He said this as fact, not comfort, and she felt the truth of it settle. He asked if she wished to file a statement about the transaction. She shook her head, not yet, and he accepted that without judgment. Silence followed, but it was not empty. Outside a bus passed. A couple laughed. Ordinary life continued. Emily took a sip of tea and felt the warmth spread. She asked why he had paid double. Alexander did not hesitate. Because the number was meant to end the argument permanently, and because sometimes clarity costs more up front but saves more later. She absorbed that. Then he asked about her plans. Emily surprised herself by answering with specifics. She wanted to finish her certification in bookkeeping. She wanted to move somewhere quieter. She wanted to send a letter to a friend she had not spoken to in years. Alexander nodded and said those were reasonable plans and that resources were available if she wanted them. Wanted again. He wrote down a contact number and slid it across the table. No pressure. Attached. Just information. The afternoon light shifted, and Emily realized time had passed without her counting it. Alexander stood and said he would leave her to rest. The residence manager would assist with anything she needed. As he turned to go, he paused and asked if she felt safe. The question landed fully this time. Emily considered it carefully and answered yes. Not because the world had changed entirely, but because someone had changed how it could be navigated. Alexander inclined his head once and left, the door closing softly behind him. Emily sat alone with the coat still around her shoulders, the room quiet and welcoming. And for the first time she understood that protection was not a cage or a leash. It was space, space to choose, space to breathe, space to imagine a future that was not measured by someone else's balance due. She stood and looked out the window at the street below, people moving with purpose and pause, and she felt the beginning of something steady take root. Not rescue, not dependence, but the slow return of ownership to herself. Morning arrived softly, filtered through tall windows and the quiet hum of a city that did not demand explanations. Emily woke without the jolt she had grown used to. No counting of steps, no inventory of exits, just a steady awareness of where she was, the coat folded neatly over a chair like a promise kept. She dressed and brewed coffee the way she liked it and noticed how choice changed small things first, the way she held the mug, the way she breathed. Later that day, Alexander Blackwood returned as he said he would, not with an entourage, but with a simple knock and a patient wait. They sat again by the window, and he asked how she had slept. She answered well, and meant it. He told her there were documents to review only if she wished, none that required her signature, only information. She agreed and listened as he explained timelines, options, and protections in language that respected her attention. He mentioned that Marcus Vane had contacted his office seeking clarification. The request had been declined. Final meant final. Emily felt a flicker of relief followed by something sturdier, confidence. Alexander asked if she wanted accompaniment should she return to collect personal belongings. She said yes, but later. Not today. He accepted the boundary and noted it. The respect of it mattered more than the offer. A call came through on his phone, and he stepped aside briefly. Emily watched how people greeted him when they passed the window, not with flattery, but with trust. When he returned, he asked if she would like to walk. They took the long way through a park where leaves moved like quiet applause. Emily spoke about her plans again, more clearly this time, about classes and letters and the small apartment she had bookmarked months ago without believing she would need it. Alexander listened and said he could help with logistics without influencing decisions. Help was a resource, not a direction. The afternoon thinned into gold, and they sat on a bench. Alexander explained that protection also meant visibility, that claims made in the open carried weight. He asked if she consented to being formally acknowledged under his authority for a limited time while she settled affairs. Consent was the word again. Emily considered it and asked what it would look like. He answered simply, a statement filed, a notice published, nothing performative. She agreed because she understood the purpose and because she had been asked. The next morning the acknowledgement appeared where it needed to, concise and unmistakable. Reactions followed quickly, messages softened, doors opened, assumptions corrected themselves. Emily moved through the day with a new steadiness. People spoke to her directly, not around her. That evening Alexander invited her to a small gathering at a civic hall, not as an obligation but as an option. She went because she wanted to see the world that had shifted so quietly. The room was warm with conversation. Introductions were brief and respectful. No one pressed. Alexander remained nearby without hovering. When a council member asked a careless question about her past, Alexander redirected smoothly without embarrassment to anyone. Emily realized protection could be graceful. Later, as they stood near the exit, Alexander asked how she felt. She searched for the word and found it. Capable. He smiled then, not wide, not public, just enough to be real, and said that capability was the point. As they parted for the night, he reminded her that the acknowledgement had an end date she could change or remove at any time. The power to end it stayed with her. Emily walked back to the residence under streetlights that felt friendlier now and understood that being claimed had never been about possession. It had been about position, about standing where she could see the horizon and choose her direction. And as she unlocked the door, she felt certain of one thing. The life ahead would be shaped by consent and clarity, and that knowledge was stronger than any contract she had ever been forced to witness. The acknowledgement changed how mornings felt. Not louder but clearer. Emily noticed it in the way her phone stopped buzzing with half-formed demands and started receiving complete sentences instead, requests instead of assumptions. She spent the week moving deliberately, enrolling in classes, scheduling a time to retrieve her belongings, mailing the letter she had rewritten 3 times until it sounded like herself again. Alexander Blackwood checked in without crowding, a brief call to confirm details, a message to ensure transportation was available, support that did not ask for gratitude. When the day came to return to her old place, the sky was pale and steady. Alexander met her at the curb with a driver who waited at a respectful distance. The building looked smaller than she remembered, less imposing now that she was not bracing against it. Inside the apartment, the air held familiar echoes. Emily packed efficiently, choosing what mattered and leaving the rest without ceremony. Alexander remained in the doorway, present but unobtrusive. When Richard Hale appeared in the hall, his steps slowed, not with anger but with uncertainty. He tried to speak her name as if it were still his to use. Emily met his eyes and said calmly that arrangements were complete and that communication should go through counsel. Alexander nodded once to confirm it. The moment passed without raised voices or spectacle. Outside, Emily exhaled and felt lighter again. That evening, Alexander invited her to review the acknowledgement timeline. She noticed how carefully it was framed, temporary, adjustable, ending automatically unless she chose otherwise. She asked why he had insisted on that structure. Alexander answered that protection should never outlast consent. She stored the sentence like a compass. Days later, the Civic Council convened for a routine session, and Alexander asked if she wished to attend as an observer. Emily agreed, curious more than nervous. The chamber was orderly, and the discussions practical: budgets, zoning, transit, nothing theatrical. When her name appeared on the agenda as a brief notice acknowledging her protected status, the chair read it plainly and moved on. No murmurs, no drama. Emily felt the quiet power of normalcy. Afterward, a council member approached to ask about her coursework. Another asked if she would consider a community internship later in the year. Interest without expectation, Alexander watched from a distance and smiled when she navigated it herself. As weeks passed, Emily settled into a rhythm. Classes twice a week, part-time work with a local firm that valued accuracy and calm, evenings spent reading or walking through the park. Alexander remained a steady point. Dinners occasionally, conversations that ranged from policy to favorite breakfasts, always bounded by choice. One evening, as they walked the long path again, Alexander mentioned that the acknowledgement period was nearing its end and asked how she wished to proceed. Emily considered the question carefully. She felt capable now, grounded. The protection had done its work by not replacing her agency. She asked if ending it would change anything between them. Alexander answered honestly that it would change the paperwork, not the respect. She appreciated the clarity. They stopped at the bench where leaves still moved like quiet applause. Emily said she would let the acknowledgement expire as scheduled and thanked him for the space it had given her. Alexander accepted the decision without hesitation and said he would ensure the transition was seamless. The next morning, the notice concluded with a final line confirming her independent status. Messages arrived congratulating her, offering support on new terms. Emily smiled at the screen and felt no fear of the ground beneath her. That evening, Alexander visited briefly to return the coat she had worn on the first day. He placed it over the chair and said she was welcome to keep it if she liked. Emily laughed softly and said she would return it when the weather warmed. A simple promise. As he left, she realized something essential had shifted. The claim that had changed her path was no longer about authority. It was about trust earned and released at the right time. And as she closed the door behind him, Emily felt certain that the next chapter would be written by her hand, steady, deliberate, and entirely her own. Independence arrived with quieter tests than Emily expected, the kind that asked for steadiness rather than courage. A misfiled document corrected without apology, a meeting where her voice carried because it was prepared, a night when she walked home alone and felt capable instead of watched. Weeks passed, and the city settled her into its rhythms. Then an invitation arrived bearing a familiar seal. A public hearing on debt practices requested by the Civic Council. Emily read it twice and understood the timing. Her experience had become relevant not as a spectacle, but as evidence. She considered declining and then considered what clarity required. She agreed to attend as a private citizen. Alexander Blackwood sent a brief note acknowledging the session and confirming he would be present in his official capacity, not beside her but across the room. The separation mattered. The hearing room filled steadily. Reporters took notes without flashes. The chair outlined procedures. Emily listened and felt the old memory flicker before it steadied. When her turn came, she spoke plainly, describing processes rather than people, explaining how assumptions turned into leverage and how consent corrected the imbalance. She avoided names and stuck to facts. The room leaned in, not to her story but to the structure of it. Questions followed, measured and fair. She answered them with dates, totals, and outcomes. Alexander did not intervene. He did not need to. The record spoke for itself. When the chair thanked her, the tone was professional, not sympathetic. Afterward, a few attendees approached with cards and cautious respect. One asked if she would consider consulting on guidelines. Another asked about training materials. Emily accepted nothing immediately and wrote everything down. Outside the chamber, the air felt open. Alexander waited near the steps and asked if she wanted coffee. They walked 2 blocks to a quiet place and sat by the window again. He said she had done well and meant it as an observation, not praise. Emily said she felt grounded, not exposed, and that surprised her. Alexander nodded and said that visibility was safest when it followed preparation. Days later, the council released recommendations, and the language echoed Emily's testimony: neutral, enforceable, clear. The change was incremental but real. Messages arrived from people she did not know thanking her for the clarity. She answered a few and archived the rest. Her life continued. Classes ended a term. Her work hours increased. One evening, Alexander invited her to a small reception marking the adoption of the guidelines. Emily hesitated and then agreed. The event was restrained, speeches brief, acknowledgments factual. When Alexander spoke, he credited staff and community members without naming her until the end, and even then he framed her role as one voice among many. Emily felt the fairness of it land. Later, as they stood near the exit, a reporter asked a direct question about the earlier transaction that had brought them into the same room months ago. Alexander answered first, stating that the matter had been resolved lawfully and that Emily Carter was present tonight as an independent professional whose contributions spoke for themselves. He turned to Emily and asked if she wished to add anything. She considered and said only that clarity protects everyone. The reporter nodded and moved on. Outside under the streetlights, Emily laughed softly and said she had not expected the question to feel that small. Alexander replied, "That time had a way of shrinking what no longer fit." They walked a while in companionable quiet, then stopped at the bench again. Emily realized the pattern had changed. She was no longer being guided through a passage. She was choosing stops along a route she recognized as her own. Alexander asked what came next. Emily answered without hesitation. She would apply for the internship, finish her certification, and move into the apartment she had bookmarked. Alexander said he would write a recommendation if she wanted it. She said yes and thanked him. When they parted, she felt a warmth that was not obligation, just mutual regard. The next morning, her acceptance letter arrived, and she smiled at the certainty of it. As she closed her laptop, Emily understood that the claim that once altered her path had completed its purpose, not by holding her close, but by standing far enough back to let her step forward. And the future opened not with drama, but with steady light. The internship began with early mornings and late notes. Emily learned the building by its quiet sounds: elevators sighing, keyboards tapping, the low murmur of decisions being made without ceremony. She liked the work because it asked for precision and rewarded patience. She liked the people because they corrected mistakes without turning them into judgments. Alexander Blackwood appeared only once that first week. Passing through the lobby with a small group, he saw her at the desk and paused, just long enough to nod, not to claim space but to acknowledge it. The nod felt like continuity rather than interruption. Days layered into weeks, and Emily found herself invited into rooms where policy met practice. She spoke when asked and listened otherwise. Her confidence grew not from praise, but from outcomes. One afternoon, a complex review stalled, and she proposed a clean framework drawn from her coursework. The team adopted it, and the room moved again. Later, her supervisor thanked her for clarity and handed her a longer-term project. Emily walked home that evening with the sense of alignment that comes when effort meets trust. A message arrived from Alexander asking if she would join him for a public forum on transparency, not as a panelist, but as an attendee. She agreed because curiosity had replaced caution. The forum drew a diverse crowd, and the conversation stayed practical. Alexander answered difficult questions without deflection when a speaker cited the recent guidelines. Emily recognized the phrasing and smiled. After the forum, a reception followed, and people gathered in easy clusters. Alexander approached Emily with 2 cups of water and offered one. They spoke about small things first, schedules, the weather turning, then about the work. He asked what surprised her most about the internship. She said how ordinary progress felt once systems were clear. Alexander said that was the goal. Progress should feel boring when it works. A council member joined them and asked Emily about her plans after the term. She answered plainly, and Alexander listened without steering. When the council member left, Alexander said he admired how she held her direction without needing validation. Emily laughed and said she had practiced. They stood near the balcony doors and watched the city lights gather. Alexander grew thoughtful and said there was something he wanted to say while the moment allowed it. Emily turned and waited. He said that when he had placed the check months ago, he had acted from duty, but what followed had been choice. He said he respected the way she had claimed her independence, and that it had changed how he understood protection. He added that he did not presume closeness beyond what she invited. The clarity of the boundary mattered. Emily considered his words and felt no pressure in them, only regard. She said she appreciated his honesty and that trust had grown because it had been allowed to grow at its own pace. They agreed to keep that pace, not faster, not slower, just true. As the reception thinned, a reporter asked for a photograph of community participants. Emily hesitated, and Alexander asked quietly if she was comfortable. She said yes and stepped forward. The picture was taken without commentary, just faces and light. Afterward, they walked a few blocks together, conversation easy. The city familiar now rather than imposing. They paused at the corner where their paths diverged, and Alexander asked if he could walk her home another night. Not as an escort, but as company. Emily smiled and said yes. Another night would be good. They parted with that simple plan, no promises layered on it. The next morning, Emily received a message confirming her internship extension, and she felt the rightness of timing settle again. Later that week, Alexander sent the recommendation letter he had offered, concise and fair. She read it once and saved it. As she closed her laptop, Emily understood that destiny did not arrive as thunder. It arrived as alignment, as 2 lives choosing integrity in parallel and recognizing the resonance. And in that recognition, she felt neither claimed nor alone, but seen, steady, and ready for what would come next. Autumn settled in with a steadiness Emily welcomed. The internship deepened into responsibility, and the city revealed its quieter edges. She moved into the small apartment she had bookmarked months ago, unpacked boxes with methodical care, and hung the coat on a hook by the door as a reminder of where clarity had begun. Evenings grew cooler, and walks grew longer, sometimes alone and sometimes with Alexander Blackwood. Always by invitation, never assumption. One night, they crossed the park as leaves gathered like soft punctuation, and Alexander asked if she would join him at a regional summit focused on ethical finance, not to speak, but to observe how decisions scaled beyond the city. Emily considered her calendar and agreed. The summit took place in a clean modern hall with glass walls and disciplined schedules. Emily listened as panels debated frameworks and safeguards. She noticed how often clarity was praised and how rarely it was practiced. During a break, a delegate recognized her name from the hearing record and asked thoughtful questions. Emily answered carefully. Alexander watched from across the room without intervening. Later he asked what she thought, and she said that good intentions needed enforceable language to survive pressure. Alexander smiled and said that was the most practical summary of the day. On the return trip, they sat side by side on the train, conversation easy, the shared quiet comfortable. Emily felt a warmth that came from alignment rather than proximity. Weeks later, a community award ceremony approached, and Emily received an invitation as a contributor to the guidelines. She hesitated at first. Public recognition still felt loud. Alexander asked what would make it easier. Emily said context and consent. He arranged both. The ceremony was brief and respectful. Emily accepted the acknowledgement and spoke a few sentences about systems over stories. Applause came and went without spectacle. Afterward, she and Alexander stood near the edge of the crowd. A reporter asked whether their paths had crossed by chance or design. Emily answered that clarity creates crossings where confusion once built walls. Alexander nodded and added that leadership meant paying attention to who was standing quietly nearby. The reporter thanked them and moved on. Later that night, they walked beneath streetlights and Alexander asked if she would like to have dinner at her place sometime. Not as an event, but as a simple evening. Emily agreed and set a date. The dinner was uncomplicated. Pasta and conversation, laughter over small mistakes. They spoke about childhood memories, favorite routines, the kind of mornings that felt right. Boundaries remained intact because they were respected. When the evening ended, Alexander thanked her for the meal and for the trust. Emily thanked him for the patience. Days later, Emily received an offer to continue with the firm beyond the internship. She accepted after reviewing the terms and sent a message to Alexander sharing the news. He replied with congratulations and a single sentence she saved. Earned things last longer. As winter approached, the city held a public forum reviewing the year's reforms. Emily attended with colleagues. Alexander presided with a steady hand. When the forum closed, he asked if she would walk with him to the river. They stood watching lights ripple across the water, and Alexander said there was something he wished to say clearly and without expectation. He said that working alongside her had changed how he understood power, that seeing independence grow when protected had affirmed his belief in gentle strength. He said that if she wished to explore something deeper, he would do so slowly and transparently. And if she did not, he would remain as he was, respectful and present. Emily felt the weight of the moment and the freedom within it. She said that she wished to explore slowly and transparently, and that the choice felt right because it was made in daylight rather than urgency. They agreed on the pace again and walked back with easy steps, hands brushing briefly without claim. As Emily unlocked her door, she felt gratitude not for rescue but for resonance, for the way two lives had met without erasing either. And she understood that destiny was not a single act but a series of aligned decisions, made openly, honored fully, and carried forward with care. Winter gave way to a clean early spring, and the city felt newly awake. Emily noticed it in the longer light, and the way plans arrived with room to breathe. Her work settled into a confident rhythm, and the firm offered a permanent role with terms she reviewed carefully and accepted without hurry. The apartment filled with small signs of permanence, framed notes, a plant that thrived by the window. The coat returned to Alexander Blackwood one mild afternoon when the air no longer asked for it. He thanked her and smiled at the symbolism without naming it. Their time together grew steady and intentional. Dinners shared, walks taken, conversations that moved easily from policy to preferences, from responsibilities to rest. Boundaries stayed clear because they were respected. One evening, Alexander invited her to attend a city address marking the close of the reform cycle. Emily agreed and chose a simple dress that felt like herself. The hall filled and quieted. Alexander spoke briefly about outcomes rather than triumphs, about the value of systems that protect without overshadowing. When he concluded, he acknowledged contributors and named Emily Carter among them with a single sentence that credited clarity and courage. No applause cue followed, and that restraint felt right. Afterward, people congratulated her with professionalism and warmth. Outside, under a sky rinsed with stars, Alexander asked if she would like to take a longer walk. They crossed the bridge where water reflected the city in calm fragments. Alexander paused and said there was one more thing he wished to state publicly and privately. Emily turned to him and waited. He said that months ago he had acted to end a transaction that treated a person as a number, and that the act had taught him something lasting. That leadership meant paying more than money. It meant paying attention, paying respect, paying the cost of doing what was right without asking for return. He said that he had come to care for her not because of circumstance, but because of character, and that if she wished he would stand with her openly as partners, not as protector and protected, but as equals choosing the same direction. Emily felt the city hold its breath and realized it was only her own. She answered with the steadiness she had earned. She said yes, openly, choosing, and that the word felt complete. They continued walking with hands joined lightly, not to signal ownership but connection. News traveled the way it always does, quietly first, and then clearly. Colleagues nodded with understanding. Friends smiled. Nothing changed about Emily's work except the ease with which she carried it. Nothing changed about Alexander's role except the warmth with which he spoke her name. They set a date for a small gathering at the park where their paths had crossed so often. Family and friends arrived without fanfare. There were no speeches, only conversation and laughter. When someone asked Emily what had changed most, she answered without rehearsing. She said that clarity had replaced fear and that consent had replaced assumption. Alexander listened and squeezed her hand once. Later, as the gathering thinned, they stood by the bench where leaves once sounded like applause, and now birds traced the air. Alexander asked if she was happy. Emily answered yes, and meant it without reservation. As twilight settled, they turned toward home. Not one home or the other, but the shared idea of it forming with each step. And Emily understood the arc of it all with a calm certainty. She had been sold like property and reclaimed like destiny, not by force but by choice, not by spectacle but by care. The claim that mattered was not written on paper or announced with noise. It was lived daily in respect and gentleness. And as the city lights came on one by one, Emily felt the future open wide, steady and bright, a promise kept not by ownership, but by love that honored strength and freedom equally.